This talk and the JavaScript for WordPress conference are brought to you by our sponsors at 10up and WP Buffs. 10up makes a better web with finely crafted websites and tools for content creators. Check out their junior and senior dev positions at 10up.com/careers. WP Buffs provides 24/7 fully managed support and white label agency services. Find out how they can help you focus on what you do best at wpbuffs.com/partnerships.
This is going to be kind of an ad hoc presentation. I'm going to go back and forth between my slides and my browser. It's kind of my John Maeda style presentation here for you. So I'll also try to follow along the chat. So if you have questions, feel free to throw them out. Otherwise, I'll answer a bunch of questions at the end. So hooks in WordPress. It's all started back with the PHP plugin API. So if you've used WordPress for development, you've probably used hooks. And I would kind of argue that hooks are what has made WordPress as successful as it is. It's what makes it very extensible for developers. And it also provides a measure of kind of backwards compatibility when we move forward with new versions of WordPress. As long as we keep these hooks in place, it enables plugins to continue to work, even though the code around them may have changed significantly. So if you've used hooks, you're familiar with all these PHP functions: has filter, add filter, apply filters, has action, add action, do action. What we're going to be talking about today is kind of the JavaScript equivalent of that and how it's going to be used in the real world, how you can use it in your plugins and themes, and also how it's being used in Gutenberg. And the whole extensibility part of hooks is really the critical thing here. It's how we build extensibility into WordPress currently. So when we started working on Gutenberg, hooks was definitely something we wanted to consider. We wanted to make sure that people will continue to be able to extend the editing experience, if not in exactly the same way that they did before, at least in a way that allows them to do the same types of things. So in core, there are literally thousands and thousands of places that we have hooks. But more significantly, just to talk about Gutenberg, on the post-edit screen, there are quite a few hooks. So this is my jumping back and forth part. So this is a issue that was opened on the Gutenberg repository way back in June of last year, where tried to outline kind of all of the existing hooks that are available on the post new and post edit screen. So these are places where developers can extend the basic functionality of the screen, and we want to try to provide that same type of extensibility in Gutenberg in some fashion. Hooks may not be the right solution, but it's one we're experimenting with for certain things. And a lot of times these hooks kind of fall into a few categories. A lot of times they are actions that are fired, and in PHP we're able to respond to an action by outputting some HTML. So we use this, for example, to insert a new field, say below the title or at the top of the edit form. These actions are fired, PHP can render, and we output what we want. And that gets output on the page in line with everything else. The other big way they're used is we filter some entire block like, for example, the featured image upload block, and that allows developers to kind of replace that wholesale with their own content if they want to. This is a really great guide just kind of to extend this idea of what we had in previously and what we can do with that in the future. This is a guide that Daniel's putting together that is a complete guide to kind of all the things that existed before and what the kind of Gutenberg equivalent of that might be, where you might take that action or feature and implement it in Gutenberg. Don't worry, I am getting back to hooks here. But I think this is a really useful resource, and I will have all this slide and all these links will be in it at the end, so don't worry if you're missing this. So this is hooks in Gutenberg. So this is considered currently an experimental API, but it is getting a lot of use and has proven very useful for Gutenberg. So do expect it to stay in Gutenberg. And basically the way this works is there's a bunch of things inside Gutenberg that are run through filters. And that allows you as a developer, enables you to alter what the result of those things are. And we're going to dig into some of these examples kind of at the end, and also talk about how you might use this in your own plugins and themes. But you can see here that blocks is one of the major places that gets filter extensibility. So for example, props on blocks can be filtered. You use an add filter statement, and you pass your callback, which in this case is adding a background style. And then you can basically filter the extra props that are passed on saved content. And you get different filters for different parts of blocks, and including edit, including when you transform a block. And then there's one that has this kind of funny name that's like block list block, which is basically filtering the entire block. And this allows you to wrap blocks with your own properties. So let's see. So WordPress JavaScript hooks started long ago. This is the ticket that I think probably has been open for a good 7 years now. We've tried to close it a couple times. We've even merged the code and reverted it. It's originally opened by Daryl Coopersmith, who is the creator of the WP Media Library. So this was really developed in an age of Backbone. And you can see that in his initial proposal, Daryl pretty much outlined all the things that we have in hooks today. It really functions very much as an equivalent to the PHP hook system, but it is also different than jQuery events, which he outlined in this very initial proposal. And we're going to get into some of I'll get into the technical parts of it in just a second, but I do think it's interesting to look at this ticket that was opened back six years ago, all the way back in WordPress 3.4, and to see sort of how it developed. The current hook library that we have is based on Carl Danley's library that was available on GitHub, and is now kind of the basis of what we have currently. Just to show the number of comments that came in on this ticket, there's been quite a bit of discussion about the best approach, how to structure the functions, how to actually do the technical implementation, and so forth. So this is a long tenured bit of code. I think the original code really hasn't changed much in the last 6 years, but I will talk about a couple of the improvements that we have made bringing this into Gutenberg. So I mentioned that we aim for feature parity. So I'm just going to open up the NPM package. So like many things, JavaScript, WordPress, these days, hooks has been released to NPM. So this means that you can bring hooks directly into your project and start using it even before it becomes available in WordPress core. You just do npm install @WordPress/hooks, and then you can import this create hooks function from WordPress hooks, and that creates the new hooks object. In core, it's very likely that we're going to have kind of one global hook bus, which is going to be at wp.hooks. The advantage for a platform like WordPress is we want to be able to have multiple plugins interacting using the same set of hooks, and that's why we would put it on a global object. But in the case of your plugin, especially if you're going to use hooks internally, you might actually have kind of an internal hooks namespace that you use. So you can see in hooks we have kind of the similar actions, like similar functions like add action, add filter, remove action, remove filter, remove all actions, remove all filters, do action, apply filters. The one big difference that we have right now is this extra parameter called function name. And we call this a namespace as well. And essentially the reason we require, currently this is a required field, the reason we require this extra naming of the function is to be able to later remove that hook. And I'll give an example in code of why you would do that. But it's important to understand that a big difference between kind of legacy PHP that we have in core, where we always use, instead of using an inline anonymous function, we use like a named function for our callback. That allows us to do remove action or remove filter later with that same function name. In JavaScript, we pretty much do anonymous functions just as a matter of course. People love to use anonymous functions everywhere. So if your callback is an anonymous function, that makes it very difficult to later remove that callback. And therefore, we've required that you actually name every callback with this function name parameter or namespace parameter. And it turns out that unhooking actions, unhooking filters is actually a really useful feature in hooks. So there's a lot of different ways this is used, but a typical example would be you have a plugin that does a whole bunch of different things. It does X, Y, and Z, but you only want it to do X and Y. So if it's built with hooks that activate the features, you can remove the hook that activates, feature Z, and that ability to remove that hook basically lets you kind of control what the plugin loads. So that is an important kind of distinction. But basically, you will find that these functions work very similar to how the PHP functions work. One other really big difference between using filters in PHP and using them in JavaScript is that the approach that we use for actions in PHP does not really work in JavaScript. So for PHP actions, like I mentioned before, we typically do this thing in the editor or in other places in core where we fire an action, and then plugins can on that action output some HTML that then gets output and rendered onto the page. With JavaScript, since the action is kind of triggered asynchronously, the execution thread just keeps going. Meanwhile, you're responding to the action. You can't just output in the middle of the content. Also, React, or like in Gutenberg, is managing all the DOM and everything, so you're not really going to be able to render in that same way. So triggering actions and outputting HTML doesn't really work, and for that reason, in Gutenberg, we've taken a different approach to that type of extensibility using something called slot fill that enables you to register a fill that will go into a slot somewhere in the interface. But where we have used hooks and where I think they're really effective is in applying filters to entire components or to specific attributes of a component, like the properties that are passed or the class names that are used. You could use it to filter default values. So it's really useful for when you want plugins to be able to alter something that's more of the filter than the action. I will show you where actions can also be useful in a little bit. All right. I'm not seeing questions yet, so I'm just going to keep going in here. Please post a link in here for the hooks library when you have a chance. So this is I'll just post in this one, which is the NPM library, and there's a link from there onto the GitHub as well. So if you're going to use it in your own project, this is how to use it. It is also available in Gutenberg, so if you're working on something that's a Gutenberg thing, you can use wp.hooks directly. And again, my expectation is when we do merge Gutenberg into core, that WP hooks will become a core object. So here's an example again of how you would use hooks. The answer to when we're going to merge it into core is with Gutenberg. So you use this create hooks function, and then you have a hooks object. And with that hooks object, you can do all the things like add action, do action. So that's just kind of simply how you would set it up on your own. Cool. Here's the GitHub repository. And we're going to dig into some of the code a little bit to kind of just talk about how hooks works internally, and also some of the development stuff we've done over the last, I don't know, a few months, maybe 6 months since we kind of have included it in Gutenberg. So this is pretty cool. And again, I could talk about how great this code is because I didn't write it. If it was all my own code, I wouldn't be so quick to tout it. But this is code that I really credit to Carl Danley's brilliance. But all of the functions. So it turns out that filters and actions are actually very similar. The main difference being that when a filter is invoked, it returns the first parameter. It's expected to return the first parameter, whereas an action is not expecting a return. So in order to generate these methods, like add filter and add hook, we actually use a generator method. So this function, create add hook, is used to create both the function add filter and the function add action. So basically, we pass in the hooks object, which is kind of our global object that we're going to use to store all of the hooks. And then we're going to add a hook with a hook name, a namespace, a callback, and a priority. And we just go through some validation to make sure that everything is valid before we add the hook. And then basically we're going to add the hook to an array of hooks that we keep track of. And when we insert them, we keep them ordered, which is nice so that we don't have to do any kind of sorting later. And then we also deal with the fact that you can be executing hooks while someone else is adding or removing a hook. And you'll see that in our tests. I'm going to look at the tests at the very end. And then finally, after a hook has been added, we trigger this action, hook added. And this is actually kind of a critical thing that we added for Gutenberg. So let's say you have a plugin you're writing and you want to create a filter that filters every block in Gutenberg and adds, let's say, a number that indicates what number that block is. It's a really bad idea, but let's say you wanted to do that. When you add your filter in, if Gutenberg has already loaded, that filter isn't going, like if it's already rendered, it's already run all the filters, your filter will not apply. If you load your filter before, you're okay, but you got to make sure the hooks object is there, the WP hooks object. What this does is it allows Gutenberg to respond. So we'll see internally in the code later that when you add a new hook, Gutenberg actually listens for this hook added event. And when you do that, it actually will re-render the filtered component. So you can actually, after the fact, add a hook and Gutenberg will respond. I realized in preparing for this talk that we don't have a similar hook removed action, that we probably should add that, because if you removed a hook, you would expect that that hooked action would also be removed, which currently it's not. So just interesting facts. We're going to just look a little bit more. This is another generator method that's used to generate a function to run the hook. So this would be to generate the methods do action and do filter. So and we're going to see at the very end how those are created. But basically, when you call this create run hook, you get to pass this return first arg. And basically, that's going to determine whether it operates as a filter or an action. Because if return first arg is true, we're going to return the first argument that's passed. And that is going to be basically like a filter. So here's the run hooks method. You can see we're using the spread operator to pass in all of the arguments. That's a fun new JavaScript operator if you haven't learned about it. Super powerful. We do our kind of normal stuff to see if the hook exists. We keep track of how many times each hook has been run. And then eventually we call our handler right here, and we return the first argument if it's been passed that we should. So that's kind of like the internals of how these two functions are built. And then just to show you how that all gets put together. So this is sort of like the initialization of hooks. We're basically creating two objects that are kind of empty, actions and filters. And so like to create the add action function, we call create add hook, and we pass it actions. And add filter, same thing, but we pass it filter. So we're tracking actions and filters as separate objects. And then, for example, here, do action, we're going to call the create run hook, which again is going to return a new function that does the do action thing. And apply filters, create run hook, filters, and we're passing true because we want to make sure that it returns the first value. So that's kind of the internals of how hooks works. It looks kind of complicated when you get into it, but the actual kind of underlying code that runs the actual hook, that's really fairly simple. We have basically two arrays of objects. We keep track of all the hooks that were registered, and then we look for a hook when you like try to apply them or do them, and if they're found, we execute them. That's pretty much what it does. The big kind of change, we made some changes, but one of the big changes that we've made since moving it over from being in a WordPress ticket to being on GitHub and being developed as a package is the ability to use it in an isolated way and not on the WP global namespace. So the ability to do that create hooks thing where you create your own hooks object. So you could do this internally for your own plugin. If you are creating a plugin, for example, that has to operate differently in different contexts, you could filter the part of it that you want to behave differently, and then in your different contexts, you can apply filters just the same way you would in PHP. But again, like thinking in this world where we're building applications in JavaScript, where everything is in JavaScript, and giving that same type of extensibility. So it could be for external other developers, but it also could be for your own internal use in your own plugin. This was a fun one. So one of the things that happens in Gutenberg, because of the rendering that happens so regularly, is hooks get run a lot, many, many, many times. And every time you add one or remove one, the run hooks gets called again on everything that's filtered. So it's important that it really be as optimal as possible. So thanks to Andrew Duffy for really digging into micro performance optimization, specifically in run hooks, which is the thing that's called all the time. Adding hooks is not something that happens frequently. But you can see, like, just he's got these ops here that he's handled. But you know, in his initial testing, we were able to do, 7 million ops per second, and he got it up to 22 million ops per second on this test machine. So really very small changes, but just comparing things like object create and seeing which is the fastest. So these optimizations are really like tiny, tiny code changes that wind up being executed so frequently that that they actually make the whole thing faster. So just to say, hooks is highly optimized. Don't worry about applying it into the core of your application, even if it's going to be run many times. It's optimized to do that. Another fun thing that we dealt with once we got this into packages was, I guess, what you would call race conditions. And you can see in our testing suite that we test for some of these. So this is doing things like adding a filter while a filter is executing, adding a filter of the same name while a filter is executing, adding a filter, removing a filter that is currently executing, removing another filter that's come before that filter in the same hook, but earlier in the priority chain or later in the priority chain, and making sure all of those things actually worked as expected. Turned out to be quite complicated, and something we actually managed to achieve. So you can see all these tests that we're doing to kind of validate that these things work as expected. And there is nothing better than having a complete test suite like this to give you confidence that your code is going to work as expected. So again, I can tell you with confidence that Hooks is very well tested, and that you can expect things to, for example, fire in order, and that removing and adding hooks, even in the middle of another hook, will work as expected, just like you can depend on in PHP. Cool. So I wanted to actually look at this with filters really quickly. This is in the Gutenberg repository. I'm just going to see if I can find it here. So this is really cool. One of the things that they've done in Gutenberg is they've introduced quite a few of these higher order components, which if you're not familiar with higher order components, these are essentially, or higher order functions, I guess they're called. These are functions that ingest a component and return a new component. So in this case, we're going to be looking at with filters, and this is the component that is used to add filtering to another component. I'm sorry, it's the helper function, right? So you call in this with filters function. You have an element that you've created. It could be a custom element. It could be a React class. And then you just export it with filters, and it's going to automatically create an add filter hook that filters this component. So just to see how this works, it basically is going to ingest, let's see, it's going to apply filters with the hook name that you pass through to the original component, and then it's going to force an update. And this is done in a throttled way, meaning it will only happen at a certain frequency. And you can see that every time a hook is added or removed, so it looks like we do have hook removed. I didn't realize that. Hook added, every time a hook is added or removed, the function to update gets called again. So that will refresh whatever components are being filtered. But this is just a very simple higher order component. It's going to give automatically create a filter with the name core/with-filters/component dash, and then the component name. So this is a really useful kind of higher order component that's being used currently in Gutenberg. And if you search the Gutenberg repository for with filters, you'll find all of the components that are currently being filtered. There really isn't like a canonical source for that information, so it is something you sort of have to hunt down to understand. But I am going to get into some examples. So I started with this page, which is from the Gutenberg handbook. This Gutenberg handbook is mirrored over from the GitHub repo. So you can go to either place. This one gets a nice little bit of formatting and these nice indexes you can click through. So there's some examples here of different types of filters that you can apply. And what I did was I created a little test plugin. And the source code for this is available on the repo. And I'm just got a few different kind of functionalities that I've added in here. So we're going to look at those. We're going to look at the demo and then just kind of see how they work. Let's see. Yep. Cool. This is the test plugin, and I will have the code and everything, the link to this at the end. But you can see these examples here are taken directly from the handbook. So this is the first one that I wanted to look at. Was this one that assigns, yeah, this one. So what this is going to do is, let's see, let me go back to my test. Yeah. So what this does is, in my filter block edit function, I have made a helper that takes the alignment of the block and adds a data attribute to the block based on that. And then I've used some styles to add a color. So you can see, based on the block color, what the alignment is. Red is left aligned, green is center aligned, blue is right aligned. Clearly, I did not go to the design talk earlier because this would be a horrible design. But what's cool about it is this is happening kind of in real time in the block. So if I refresh here, hopefully the refresh will work. And you'll see, like, these things are not present. Like, there's no styling until I click this filter block edit. Whoops. Hey, now it's not working. That was great. It worked the first time. Let's look at the code really quickly. It does that. Oh, I think maybe I didn't push the latest code up is probably why it's not working. So what we're doing here, though, is we are taking each block that comes in. Oh, here it is. It was the last button. I clicked the wrong button. So what we're doing is we're filtering every single block. We're adding this filter blocklist block, editor blocklist block, which is every single block is going to get past this filter. This is the name of our function with data align, and then this is the callback with data align. And what this function does is basically it's going to take in the existing block and add a new property to it. It's going to add this data alignment property. So it's going to be based on the block's alignment. So it's adding a data alignment property to the block based on its alignment. So if we were to inspect, for example, this block, come on. We can see when I hit this button, hey, that's not what I wanted. Let me do a new post. Beauty of live demos. Well, my thing is broken, so we'll just ignore that for now. It was working before. But anyway, in the demo, you'll be able to test these things out. Here's another one that I can show you that hopefully will work. This one will add a red background to every block. So I have not applied it now. It's only done on save. So what I'm going to do is click this filter extra props and then click preview. Oops, I think I need to save. I'm sorry. Save draft. Hey, there they are, the red backgrounds. So every block got a red background. And again, just kind of looking at the code of how this works, this is going to filter the extra props. And basically for every single block, we're just adding this style background color red. So these are very, very kind of simple examples, but they do sort of show you how you can use filters in Gutenberg currently. This is a really good article from Riyadh that kind of goes into filter use in a little bit more detail. Riyadh has been really good about kind of blogging about different extensibility points. in Gutenberg, and you'll see in this article where he has some information about filters, which I think is really useful. So one more thing I want to show you in my code, and then I'm actually almost ready to wrap up. Let's see if I can get this plugin loaded here in my editor. This is the real-time part of it that I was talking about. So this is, I wanted to show an example of kind of hooking for setup. So to start up this app, instead of running the code directly when the DOM is ready, I've actually hooked an action. So what this is doing here is I've got my app startup function, and I'm adding it to a callback. So whenever start app is triggered, I'm going to call my app startup. And then later, I call WP Hooks do action start app. And that's what actually causes the app to start. If I were to comment this out, and let's see if it's building. It is building. So if I refresh and all is well, you will see, so nothing got inserted up here because the app did not initialize. Go ahead and let it initialize. So here's another thing that I'm going to do. At the very top of the app, I have a little thing that says test buttons, and I'm applying a filter called button name to it. So you can see up on the page. Oh, I didn't save. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually just in real time add a filter to that. So I can just do that right in the console. So right up here where it says test buttons, when I drop this filter into the console, it's going to change to this is the new name. And you can see that responded immediately right up there. This is the new name. And I can change that and add another filter. And that changes immediately. So again, to see how that works in code, there's kind of two parts of it. One is that the text itself is wrapped in this apply filters call. And then the second thing is in the component did mount function, we're setting up this callback so that when hook added is called, we force an update on our component. And that's pretty much it. So that's my whirlwind tour of hooks. Before I finish up, I just wanted to mention like a couple of things. I mean, I've kind of talked about it a little bit, but just to kind of reiterate that, I've given some examples of how you can use this in Gutenberg, but you can also use this in your own plugins. So if you are creating a plugin that's in JavaScript and you want to try to make it extensible for other people, think about using WP Hooks as a way to do that. If you want to make your default values filterable, if you want to make a conditional event be filterable, you can do this using WP Hooks. Also, if you build your plugin, if it's a modular type of plugin, have the different parts initialized using callbacks. So using add action, do action. This would enable other plugins to say disable parts of your plugin by removing those actions. It's also important to listen for hooks that are being added or removed because we don't really know in JavaScript when those events would happen. So if you want your application to respond to hooks, you need to make sure to listen for those events. and it's not appropriate for everything. There are certain things that don't really work very well from a filtering perspective, and maybe are better extensibility-wise, better fulfilled by things like slot fill. That's what we're using in Gutenberg when we want to enable people to insert content in different parts of the editor. Yeah, and I guess that's all I have for my tips for using WP hooks and inside of WP hooks. I hope that's been informative. I'm going to go look at the Slack and see if I've missed any questions. But that's where the test plugin is that you can see kind of with the sample code. And I will also upload this slideshow to that GitHub repo right after I get off this talk.
Thanks for watching this talk from the JavaScript for WordPress conference. If you're interested in more talks like this, head over to javascriptforwp.com/conference to see an archive of all talks, as well as information about upcoming events.